In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. And somewhere between the wars, in the blackest ship you've never heard of, a man walks corridors that press silence into your skull like a second skeleton. 41 years of it, he's stopped counting. Hey, I'm your brother from the void, and this is Tales from the Void. Today's story comes from a place the Imperium doesn't talk about: the black ships. The shadow that falls across a world with no edges and no name. The shape in the sky that makes entire planets flinch. And aboard one of those ships, a cell warden named Edrath Moon, who has spent 4 decades walking past observation slits, delivering human cargo to holy Terra. Cargo that walks aboard on 2 legs, weeping, and is carried off on gurneys, silent. This is a story about what it costs to keep the Astronomicon burning, about the children sitting on stone floors who know something terrible is coming before they're told, about the Sisters of Silence who walk into a room and make reality go dead, and about the man who puts the restraints on and does not think about it because thinking is a luxury the black ships don't allow. You won't find this in any hymn. That's the point. Settle in. This is Tales from the Void. Let's begin. The first thing you learn aboard a black ship is that silence has weight. Not the absence of sound, no. Any fool on a quiet world can tell you what silence feels like. I mean a silence that presses against your skull from the inside. A silence that sits in your chest like a stone you swallowed years ago and never passed. A silence that makes you forget what your mother's voice sounded like, what rain sounds like on a tin roof, what it feels like to laugh without something cold coiling in your stomach the moment the sound leaves your throat. That kind of silence, the kind that becomes a second skeleton inside you, holding up what's left of the man you used to be. My name is Edrath Moon. I have served as a cell warden aboard the Sable Remittance for what the ship's chronometers tell me is 41 standard years. I say what the chronometers tell me because I am not certain I trust them. Time is a liar aboard a vessel that spends half its existence threading through the immaterium, and my own memory is an unreliable witness for reasons I will get to in due course. What I can tell you with certainty is this: I have walked the black iron corridors of this ship for longer than most men live. I have looked through the observation slits of more containment cells than I can count, and I have delivered more human beings to holy Terra than any regiment of the Astra Militarum has delivered to a battlefield. The difference is that my cargo walks aboard on 2 legs, weeping, and is carried off on gurneys, silent. That is the work. That has always been the work. And if you are listening to this, if some strange twist of fate has carried my words beyond the hull of this wretched cathedral of iron and despair, then I want you to understand something before we go any further. I am not a brave man. I am not a righteous man. I am a tool that has not yet broken, and that is the only reason I am still here. Let me tell you about the moment a black ship arrives. I have seen it from both sides now, though only one of those perspectives remains clear to me. The arrival, as viewed from the ship itself, is a bureaucratic affair. Coordinates are confirmed with the navigatrix. The seneschal issues the formal tithe demand via encrypted astropathic burst, transmitted through channels so heavily warded that even our own shipboard astropath bleeds from the ears during broadcast. Clearance codes are exchanged with the orbital defense platforms, if the world has any. Most do not. Most of the worlds we visit are middling places, agri-worlds and mining colonies, and feral backwaters where the concept of orbital defense amounts to a man with a telescope and a las lock standing on a watchtower, squinting at the sky. The ship descends to high anchor, and the lighters begin their work. But from below, from the surface, that is a different thing entirely. I have been told by men who remember their lives before the remittance that the arrival of a black ship is the worst day in a world's century. Imagine it. You are a farmer on some backwater in the Segmentum Obscurus, a place called, let us say, Prothis-Ven, because I have been there and I remember the color of its sky, a sickly amber that made everything look like it was already dead. You have spent your whole life tilling soil that fights you, praying to an emperor you have never seen and never will, paying your tithes of grain and ore and flesh for the Astra Militarum, watching your sons march away to wars they will never return from. And then one morning the sky goes dark, not like a storm, not like an eclipse. A shadow falls across your fields that has no edges, no shape you can name, just a pressure, a wrongness, as if the sky itself has developed a bruise. You look up and there it is, a shape so black it seems to drink the light around it. No running lights, no insignia visible from the ground, just a vast, blunt silence hanging above your world like a fist that has not yet decided whether to open or to close. The governor will have known, of course. The tithe demand arrives weeks in advance through astropathic channels, and the preparations begin immediately. The Arbites move through the cities and the settlements with their lists. Every child, every man, every woman who has been reported, suspected, whispered about, the ones who make things move without touching them, the ones whose dreams bleed into reality, the ones who hear voices that no one else can hear, or who can tell you what you are thinking before the thought has fully formed, the ones the neighbors avoid, the ones the village-sanctioned preachers call cursed. Every world has them, hiding in root cellars and abandoned habs, concealed by frightened parents, or locked away in chains by communities that understood, on some primal level, that these people were doors that should never be opened. The Arbites find them. They always find them, and they bring them to the collection points, which are usually the largest structure in each settlement. A temple or a tithe hall or a grain warehouse repurposed for the occasion. Its windows boarded, its doors reinforced, its walls daubed with hexagrammic wards painted in blessed oils by whatever ministorum functionary the governor could press into service. I have walked into those collection points. I have seen what waits inside. Children, mostly. So many of them are children. You would think the psychic gift, if you can call a death sentence a gift, would favor the old, the experienced, those who have lived long enough to develop such aberrations. But it does not. It blooms in the young, 8 years old, 10, 12, sitting on cold stone floors with their arms wrapped around their knees, shaking because they know. They always know. Whatever ability they possess, however dim or wild or uncontrolled, it tells them one thing clearly: something terrible is coming. And they are right. I am what is coming. I am the hand that reaches down from that shadow in the sky, and I will take them from everything they have ever known, and most of them will never see a sky of any color again. The collection itself is a precise operation, refined by 10,000 years of repetition into something almost mechanical. We descend in armored lighters, 6 at a time from the remittance's launch bays, each one carrying a complement of 20 wardens, 4 arbitrators seconded to the ship's authority, and at least 1 Sister of Silence. The lighters are ugly, graceless things, built for function rather than intimidation, though intimidation is an unavoidable consequence of their appearance. Black hulls, blunt prows, no windows. The sound they make as they enter atmosphere is a low, grinding moan, like a vast machine in pain, and I have watched entire crowds flinch at that sound, shrinking back from the landing zones, as if the noise itself might swallow them. We disembark in formation. The wardens wear void black carapace armor with sealed helms, visors tinted so dark that our faces are invisible. This is deliberate. We are not meant to be people. We are meant to be a process, an extension of the ship's will, and the ship's will does not have a human face. Each of us carries a shock maul and a compact las pistol, though the pistol is a last resort. The shock mauls are calibrated to subdue a psyker mid-manifestation without killing them. We need them alive. Dead psykers are wasted fuel, and the Astronomicon is a furnace that never stops burning. The Sister of Silence walks at the center of our formation, and she is the true weapon. I have served alongside 7 different sisters in my decades aboard the Remittance, and every one of them has been the same in the way that matters. The air around them goes dead. There is no other way to describe it. When a Sister of Silence walks into a room, it is as if someone has reached into the fabric of reality and pulled out a thread that you did not know was there, but that was holding something essential together. Normal men feel it as unease, a crawling of the skin, a sudden certainty that something is watching them from a direction that does not exist. Psykers feel it as agony. I have seen children collapse the moment a sister rounds a corner, screaming, clutching their heads, blood pouring from their noses, because whatever connection they have to the Imperium, that invisible lifeline that is both their curse and their identity, the sister's mere presence severs it like a knife through a nerve. It is brutal and efficient. The ones who resist stop resisting. The ones who might manifest, who might tear open a hole in reality and let something through in their terror and despair, find that they cannot. The door is closed. The sister stands in front of it, and she does not need to speak or move or even look at them. She simply is, and that is enough. I remember one collection in particular, Prothis Ven, the amber sky world I mentioned. We had intelligence of a significant cluster of emergent psykers in the planet's northern hemisphere, a settlement called Durath's Landing, built on the shores of an acid-laced inland sea. The governor had gathered them in the settlement's main chapel, a stone building with a roof of corrugated tin that groaned in the chemical wind. When we entered, there were over 300 souls inside, men, women, children. The youngest might have been 4 or 5, a girl with ash-colored hair sitting in the lap of a woman I assumed was her mother. The oldest was a man who looked ancient, his face a map of wrinkles, his eyes milky with cataracts. But behind those dead-looking eyes, something vast and terrible was coiling. I could feel it. Not in any way I could have articulated at the time, not in a way that made logical sense. Just a pressure, a wrongness, a sense that the old man was not entirely contained within his own skin. I reported it to the sister walking point, Knight Centura Seraleth, signing the alert in the tactile shorthand we use for such things. 3 taps on the left vambrace. She did not respond visibly because the Sisters of Silence communicate in their own way and on their own terms. She simply changed her path, angling toward the old man, and as she drew within 10 paces of him, he began to scream. It was not a human scream. It started as one, a raw, guttural sound of pain and terror, but within seconds it had modulated into something else, a harmonic that no human throat should have been able to produce, a sound that seemed to come from underneath the scream, as if something else was using his voice as a doorway. The tin roof buckled. 3 of my wardens staggered. One of them, a man named Brenthal, who had served 12 years and should have known better, tore off his helmet and vomited blood onto the stone floor. And the old man's eyes, those milky, dead-looking eyes, were suddenly burning. Not metaphorically, literally burning, white-hot light pouring from his sockets like molten metal from a crucible, and his mouth was open wider than any human mouth should open. And the sound coming from him was a language I did not know, but somehow horribly, almost understood. Knight Centura Soralith closed the distance in 4 strides. She did not draw her blade. She simply placed her gauntleted hand on the old man's forehead, and the light went out. All of it. The screaming stopped. The harmonic died. The old man crumpled like a puppet with its strings cut, and when we checked his pulse, there was nothing. His heart had simply stopped. The connection, whatever it was, whatever foul thing had been trying to claw its way through him, had been severed so violently that his body could not survive the severance. The little girl with the ash-colored hair watched the whole thing without blinking, without crying, without any expression at all. When I came to put the restraints on her, she looked up at me with eyes the color of old iron and said very quietly, "You can hear it too, can you not?" I told myself she was confused, frightened, saying nonsensical things the way children do when the world stops making sense. I locked the restraint around her thin wrist, and I led her to the lighter, and I did not think about what she had said. I am very good at not thinking about things. The mind scrubs help with that, but even before the scrubs, I had a talent for it. A man who thinks too much aboard a black ship is a man who does not last. There is a slip of paper in my boot that reads, in my own handwriting from a year I cannot place. The ash-haired girl knew. She looked at me and she knew. What did she see? Do not let the scrub take this. I do not remember writing those words, but I found the slip 7 years ago, and I have kept it. And every time I read it, I feel the same cold recognition, as if some part of me that exists below the reach of the Telepathica's probes is nodding. The loading is the worst part of any collection. Not because of the violence, though there is sometimes violence. Not because of the resistance, though there is often resistance. The worst part is the cooperation. The ones who come willingly. The parents who hand over their children with steady hands and dry eyes, because the Ministorum has taught them that to give a child to the black ships is to give them to the Emperor himself, and what greater honor could there be? I have had fathers press their psyker sons into my arms with blessings on their lips, murmuring prayers of thanks that their child has been chosen for holy service on distant Terra. They do not know. They cannot know. If they knew that their child would spend months sealed in a cell barely large enough to lie down in, surrounded by wards that burn the psychic mind like acid, fed nutrient paste through a slot in the door, listening to the screams of other psykers who are losing their sanity one day at a time, and that at the end of that journey, their bright-eyed, terrified boy or girl would most likely be strapped to a device and slowly, agonizingly drained of their life essence to feed a beacon of light that they will never see. I think they would fight. I think they would choose death first. But they do not know, and so they smile and they wave, and they watch the lighters climb back into that terrible shadow with their children inside, and they tell themselves that the Emperor provides. I do not judge them for their ignorance. Ignorance is a mercy. It is the only mercy that the Imperium provides in any reliable quantity. We lose them sometimes during the collection. Not often, but it happens. A parent who changes their mind at the last moment, who grabs their child and runs, and the Arbites have to pursue, and the pursuit ends badly because it always ends badly, because you cannot outrun the shadow of a black ship any more than you can outrun the tide. I witnessed such an incident on a world called Benvaris Reach, a hive world on the trailing edge of the Segmentum Solar. A father, broad-shouldered, with the scarred hands of a manufactorum worker, decided at the gates of the collection point that he would not hand over his daughter. She was perhaps 9. He lifted her onto his shoulders and he ran through the crowd, through the market stalls outside the tithe hall, into the warren of alleys that webbed the lower hive. We caught them in a dead-end corridor 7 minutes later. The father had put his daughter behind him and was standing with his fists raised, as if fists could stop carapace armor and shock mauls and the will of the Imperium. He was weeping, not from fear, from fury. A helpless, incandescent rage that burned in his eyes like phosphor, and I understood it, and I respected it, and I hit him with my shock maul until he fell, because that was my duty, and my duty does not accommodate understanding or respect. The girl did not scream. She walked to the lighter of her own accord, stepping over her father's unconscious body, and she looked back at him exactly once before the ramp closed. I do not know what happened to the father. I do not know if he was punished. I know that his daughter was loaded into Hold 9 and catalogued as Cargo Reference 7741 Theta, and that her biometric readout was stable for the first 3 weeks of transit before it flatlined on day 24, and that the notation in the logbook listed the cause of cessation as spontaneous psychic collapse, and that I wrote those words myself because it was my shift and my responsibility, and my handwriting did not shake because the mind scrubs had smoothed away whatever part of me would have shaken. Once the cargo, and I use the word deliberately because that is what the manifests call them, cargo. Once the cargo is loaded, the lighters return to the remittance, and the intake processing begins. Each psyker is cataloged, biometrically tagged, and assigned a containment cell based on a preliminary assessment of their psychic potential. This assessment is conducted by the ship's senior astropath, a soul-bound wretch named Califex, who has served the remittance for longer than I have, and who I am fairly certain went completely mad at least a decade ago, though the distinction between a mad astropath and a functional one is finer than most people realize. Califex sits in a shielded chamber on the upper decks, surrounded by enough hexagrammic warding to contain a minor demonic incursion, and he reaches out with his mind and touches each new arrival. Briefly, gently by his standards, which still leaves most of them unconscious and several bleeding from every orifice. He grades them, ranks them, and stamps their manifest entry with a sigil that determines their fate. A small thing, that sigil, a brushstroke of ink on parchment. It means nothing to the psyker who receives it. It means everything. It means whether they will live as an astropath, serve as a sanctioned battle psyker, or burn in the choir of the Astronomicon. The ship departs. The shadow lifts. Prothis Ven goes back to its amber-skied, acid-winded existence, minus 300 souls that no one will remember in a generation. And we move on to the next world and the next and the next, filling the holds of the sable remittance one terrified soul at a time, until the ship is full and the long journey to Terra begins. This is how it starts. This is how it always starts. Let me tell you now about the ship itself, because the sable remittance is not merely a vessel. It is a condition, a state of being, a wound in the void that never heals, and everything inside it is infected. The remittance is old, not old in the way that a building is old, or a city, or even a civilization. Old in the way that grief is old. Old in the way that a wrong committed so long ago that no one remembers the original sin, only the punishment is old. The ship's cogitators place her commissioning date somewhere in the early years of the 32nd millennium, which makes her nearly 9,000 standard years of service, give or take the centuries that vanish in warp transit like water through a cracked hull. She is a Constance-class heavy transport, though that designation tells you almost nothing useful, because every black ship is modified so extensively from its base pattern that the original design is little more than a suggestion, a skeleton over which millennia of additions, modifications, and desperate field repairs have layered a body of iron and misery that bears no resemblance to whatever the ancient shipwrights of the Magadan orbital yards originally intended. From the outside, the remittance is a slab of darkness against the stars. There are no running lights, no navigation beacons, no external illumination of any kind. Standard Imperial naval doctrine requires vessels to maintain visible lighting at all times for identification and collision avoidance. Black ships operate under no such requirement. We move through the void as shadows move across a wall, visible only by what we obscure. The hull is coated, and I mean coated in a literal, physical sense, with a substance that the tech adepts call sable lacquer, a psychically resistant compound of unknown origin that absorbs light, sensor returns, and, if the older wardens are to be believed, hope. I have touched it during exterior repair details, wearing void-rated gloves, and even through the insulation I could feel it. A coldness that was not temperature, a deadness that had nothing to do with the void. The hull of a black ship does not merely keep the vacuum out, it keeps something in, or rather, it keeps the contents of the ship from resonating with the immaterium, like a hand clamped over the mouth of a screaming child. The interior architecture of the remittance is not designed for human comfort. This is not unusual in Imperial vessels. Comfort is a luxury reserved for flag officers and rogue traders, and even they would find the remittance's accommodations nightmarish. The corridors are narrow and low-ceilinged, barely wide enough for two men to walk abreast, constructed from the same psychically inert black metal as the hull. Every surface is covered in wards, hexagrammic sigils inscribed by the Scholastia Psychona's artifice savants line every bulkhead, every deck plate, every rivet and seam and weld joint. They are not decorative, they are functional, layered atop one another in patterns so dense and intricate that the walls seem to crawl if you look at them too long, and they serve a single purpose: to create a dead zone. A place where the immaterium cannot reach, a place where the warp, that churning, sentient ocean of psychic energy that underlies all of reality, is held at bay by sheer force of engineered denial. Walking through the remittance is an experience I would not wish on my worst enemy, and I have several. The null fields generated by the ward networks permeate every deck, every chamber, every breath of recycled air. Even those of us with no psychic sensitivity feel it. A constant low-grade wrongness, like the feeling you get when you walk into a room where something terrible has just happened and the evidence has been cleaned up, but the air still remembers. Your stomach churns, your teeth ache, your thoughts become sluggish, wading through something thick and resistant, and occasionally, for no reason you can identify, you will stop mid-step and feel an overwhelming urge to weep. Not from sadness, not from any identifiable emotion, just a raw, animal response to an environment that is, on some fundamental level, hostile to the presence of a soul. The tech adepts call this effect psychosomatic null resonance. The wardens call it the drip because it wears you down the same way water wears down stone, drop by drop, year by year, until one day you look in the polished metal surface of your locker door and do not recognize the face staring back at you. The ship is divided into 3 primary zones, and understanding this division is essential to understanding what life aboard a black ship actually means. The upper decks, from the bridge down to the officer country on decks 3 through 7, are the most tolerable sections of the vessel. The ward density is lower here, the null fields calibrated to a level that a baseline human can endure without significant psychological degradation, at least in theory. This is where the seneschal and the senior officers of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica conduct their business. This is where the ship's astropath maintains his shielded sanctum, and where the navigatrix of House Granicus, our current mistress of the Immaterium, a gaunt and ancient woman named Pylothea, whose third eye has seen more of the warp's horrors than any living creature should be forced to witness, sits in her blister at the ship's prow and guides us through the screaming madness of warp transit. The upper decks have proper lighting, regulated atmospheric processing, even a small chapel dedicated to the Emperor, though the services held there are perfunctory and grim, conducted by a ship's confessor who drinks more amasec than he distributes sacraments, and who has not smiled in the 11 years I have known him. The middle decks are where the crew lives, and I use the word lives in its loosest possible sense. These are the warden's quarters, the armories, the mess halls, the training chambers, the medici stations, and the mind scrub facilities. The ward density here is moderate, a compromise between the need to keep the crew functional and the need to suppress any psychic resonance from the containment holds below. Living in the middle decks is like living inside a headache, not a sharp pain, not a migraine, just a constant dull pressure behind your eyes that never fully resolves. A low-frequency vibration in your bones that you stop consciously noticing after the first few years, but that your body never stops reacting to. Sleep is difficult, dreams are rare, and when they come, they are uniformly unpleasant, gray and formless, and suffused with a sense of dread that has no object and no origin. The crew quarters are small, functional, and identical. A cot, a locker, a fold-down writing shelf that no one uses because there is nothing to write about and no one to write to. We are not permitted personal effects beyond the standard kit. No picts, no keepsakes, no letters from home. Home is a concept that the black ships do their best to erase, and they are very effective at it. The lower decks are the containment holds, and they are the heart of the ship in the way that a tumor is the heart of a disease. This is where the psykers are kept. 13 holds, each one a cathedral-sized space subdivided into individual cells, row upon row upon row, stacked 3 levels high, connected by grated walkways and serviced by ancient cargo lifts that groan and shudder with each activation. The ward density in the containment holds is extreme. The walls are not merely inscribed with hexagrammic sigils. They are constructed from them. Layer upon layer of warding material, compressed and forged into structural elements so that the very architecture of the holds is a weapon against the psychic. The null fields here are generated by dedicated emitter arrays, massive humming devices installed in the deck plates and the ceiling vaults, powered by their own dedicated plasma reactors, and they project a field so dense and so total that standing in a containment hold feels like standing at the bottom of an ocean of nothingness. Your senses dim, colors fade, sounds become flat and directionless, and if you happen to possess even the faintest spark of psychic sensitivity, even the most negligible, latent, unregistered trace of connection to the Imperium, the holds will find it, and they will crush it, and you will feel it like a hand closing around your heart and squeezing. I spend most of my waking hours in the lower decks. That is my assignment. That is my purpose. I walk the grated walkways between the cells, checking containment integrity, monitoring the biometric feeds that track each psyker's vital signs, ensuring that the nutrient delivery systems are functioning, that the waste extraction units are operational, that the wards on each cell door are intact and uncompromised. It is monotonous, grinding, soul-eroding work, and I have been doing it for 4 decades. The cells themselves are uniform, 2 meters by 2 meters by 2 meters, constructed from warded black metal, sealed with a heavy door that has a single observation slit at eye level and a nutrient slot at waist height. There is no bedding inside the cells, no sanitation facilities beyond a reclamation grate in the floor. No light source because psykers in distress have been known to use even the faintest illumination as a focal point for manifestation. The occupants sit in darkness, in silence, in a null field so oppressive that most of them lose the ability to speak within the first week. I check the cells. I walk the rows. I stop at each door and look through the slit, briefly, clinically, the way a farmer checks his livestock. This comparison is not as callous as it sounds. It is, in fact, the comparison that the seneschal herself uses in her official communications. Cargo, livestock, assets to be delivered intact and functioning. The language is deliberate, designed to prevent the crew from making the mistake of seeing the contents of the cells as people. Because if you see them as people, you cannot do this work, and this work must be done. But they are people. Throne help me, they are people. I see them through the slits. A woman curled in the corner of her cell, rocking back and forth, her lips moving in a prayer that produces no sound because the null field has stolen her voice. A boy no more than 12, pressing his palms flat against the cold metal floor, as if trying to feel something, anything, through the deadening ward work. An old man sitting perfectly still, eyes open, staring at nothing because he learned weeks ago that there is nothing to see and nothing to hear and nothing to feel, and he has retreated into whatever fortress his mind has constructed against the nothingness. A young woman who has scratched words into the metal wall with her fingernails, words I cannot read because they are in a language I do not recognize, a language that might be her homeworld's dialect, or might be something else entirely, something that was whispered into her mind from a place that the wards cannot entirely silence. And in the cell beside hers, scratched into the warded metal with such force that the grooves catch the faint light from the walkway, 4 words that I have seen in a dozen different cells across a dozen different voyages, always the same, always in different handwriting, as if the question is not asked by individuals, but by the holds themselves. Where are we going? I have reported these markings. They are cleaned. They always reappear. The sound of the containment holds is unique. You would expect screaming, and in the early days of a voyage, when the holds are freshly loaded with new acquisitions, there is screaming. A great deal of it. Raw, ragged, throat-shredding screaming that echoes off the warded walls and reflects back, distorted, multiplied, until it sounds as if the ship itself is in pain. But as the days pass and the null fields do their work, the screaming fades. The psykers do not find peace, and they do not accept their fate. The fields simply strip away their ability to express their anguish. The connection between their minds and their bodies weakens, frays, and the screams become whimpers, and the whimpers become silence, and the silence is worse than the screaming ever was, because at least the screams meant they were still fighting. The silence means they have been broken, and broken psykers are easier to transport, but harder to look at. There is one more sound in the containment holds, and it is the sound that I have never been able to explain to anyone who has not heard it. A hum, low, almost subsonic, right at the edge of perception. It is not a mechanical hum. The tech adepts have checked the emitter arrays, the plasma conduits, every vibrating component in the lower decks, and none of them produce a frequency that matches. It is not a biological sound either. It does not come from the psykers, at least not from any individual one of them. It comes from the holds themselves, from the space between the cells, from the very air, as if the concentrated psychic potential of 2,000 captive souls, suppressed and compressed and denied expression by the ward work, has found a way to vibrate at a frequency that the wards cannot quite contain. A resonance, a ghost of a choir. Sometimes late in my shift, when the overhead lumens have been dimmed to simulate a night cycle that means nothing in the void, I hear it swell just slightly, and I feel something inside me respond. A tightening, a recognition. Some part of me knows that sound, knows it intimately, and wants desperately to answer it. I do not answer it. I walk my rounds. I check my cells. I do my work. But the hum is always there, and it knows my name. Above the containment holds, between the cell blocks and the walkways, suspended from the vaulted ceilings on chains of warded iron, hang the sensors. Hundreds of them, swinging gently with the ship's motion, producing a thin, acrid smoke that is supposed to have psychic dampening properties. Whether it does or not, I cannot say. What I can say is that the smoke gives the holds a perpetual haze, a grayish-white mist that smells of burned herbs and machine oil and something else, something underneath that I have never been able to identify. It is not a chemical smell. It is more like a memory of a smell, the olfactory equivalent of that hum, a sensation that exists at the very threshold of perception and refuses to resolve into anything recognizable. The sensors also produce a sound, a faint metallic chiming as they sway, and this sound, combined with the hum and the occasional muffled sob from behind a cell door, creates an atmosphere that I can only describe as liturgical, as if the containment holds are a church, and the psykers inside are the congregation, and the service being performed is one of slow, methodical annihilation. I have heard newcomers to the crew describe the remittance as a cathedral. They are not wrong. The junctions between major sections are marked by archways carved with devotional inscriptions, most of them warnings. The witch is the enemy of all. Suffer not the psyker to live unchecked. By his will alone is the darkness kept at bay. The containment holds have the proportions of cathedral naves, and the cell blocks are arranged in rows that echo the pews of a place of worship. But this is a cathedral dedicated to negation. Every surface, every sigil, every warded plate exists for a single purpose: to hold closed a door that the universe is constantly, relentlessly trying to open through the minds of the people locked in these cells. There is a chamber at the very heart of the containment section, at the intersection of all 13 holds, that the crew calls the reliquary. It is not marked on any official schematic. It does not appear in the ship's records, but every warden knows it is there because every warden has felt it. The reliquary is a circular room, perhaps 30 meters in diameter, with walls of solid warding material that are over 2 meters thick. Inside, according to the few senior wardens who claim to have been permitted entry, there is nothing. An empty room with a smooth floor and a domed ceiling, and a single unlit lumen fixture that has never been activated. I have my doubts about these accounts. The wardens who told them were baseline humans, and they described the experience with a vagueness that suggests they may have stood at the threshold and felt the room rather than seen it, their minds filling in details to make sense of a sensation that defied comprehension. The reliquary serves no apparent purpose. It contains no equipment, no furnishings, no markings, and yet the null field emanating from that room is the most intense on the entire ship. Standing outside the reliquary's sealed door, I can feel it pulling at something inside me, a gentle but insistent tug, the room trying to draw something out of me that I did not know I possessed. The senior wardens say that the reliquary is a failsafe, that it has been activated twice in the ship's history, and that both times every psyker in the holds died simultaneously. Every single one, and several crew as well. I believed this for decades. I believe it less now. I think the truth is simpler and worse. Those two events were not activations. They were overflows. The thing inside the reliquary built past some threshold that the ward work could not contain, and it spilled outward, and the force of 9,000 years of accumulated psychic residue, released in a single uncontrolled pulse, was enough to stop every heart in the lower decks. The senior wardens call it a weapon because a weapon is something you can control. What the reliquary actually is, I suspect, is something no one controls at all. I try not to stand too close to the reliquary. I try not to think about why its pull feels less like a threat and more like an invitation. Let me tell you about the crew, because we are as much prisoners of this ship as the cargo we carry, though our cells are larger and our chains are made of duty rather than metal. The sable remittance carries a complement of approximately 4,000 souls, not counting the psyker cargo. This is several times the crew of a comparable naval vessel, and every additional body serves a purpose: redundancy. The attrition rate among black ship crews is not spoken of in official records, but I have served long enough to know the numbers. In any given standard year, we lose between 8 and 12% of the crew to various forms of incapacitation. Some go mad, quietly and completely, and are found in their bunks or in some forgotten corridor, staring at a wall and whispering to no one. Some develop physical ailments that the medici officers cannot explain. Tremors, seizures, spontaneous blindness, a wasting of the limbs that no treatment can reverse. Some simply disappear, not in the sense that they desert because there is nowhere to desert to on a ship in the void, but in the sense that they are present for morning muster and absent by evening, and no search of the ship can locate them, and their bunk is empty, and their kit is in their locker, and the only trace of their existence is a name on a manifest and a gap in the duty roster that is filled within the day. The official explanation for these disappearances is null field exposure syndrome, which is a clinical way of saying that the ship ate them. We are replaceable. That is the fundamental truth of crewing a black ship. The worlds that supply the remittance's complement are bound by ancient contracts with the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, agreements that predate the current era by millennia. These worlds, a handful of settlements clustered in the Sol proximate sectors, provide a steady stream of recruits in exchange for exemption from the standard Imperial tithe. My own homeworld, Vrethus Hollow, is one such place. A bleak planet in the segmentum solar, tidally locked to a dim red star, where the habitable zone is a narrow strip of twilight between a frozen night side and a scorched day side. The people of Vrethus Hollow are miners, and they have been providing bodies for the black ships for as long as anyone can remember. When you reach a certain age, you are tested. They are looking for a specific type of person, psychically inert, emotionally resilient, and possessed of what the assessors call a high null tolerance threshold. I passed the tests. I was 17. I was put on a shuttle and sent to the remittance, and I never went back. I never went back. That sentence contains more grief than I have the ability to express, so I will not try. I will simply note that the crew of a black ship is, by design and by policy, severed from the rest of the Imperium. We do not send letters. We do not receive them. We have no leave, no rotation, no opportunity to visit our homeworlds or see our families or touch the surface of any planet except in the course of a collection operation, at which point we are armored and helmed and surrounded by the machinery of our duty. Our world is the ship, our community is the crew, our purpose is the work. Everything else is erased, slowly and deliberately, by the mind scrubs that are the price of our continued service. The mind scrubs. Let me explain those, because they are the mechanism by which the black ships maintain their crews, and they are the reason I am not sure how much of what I remember is real. Every 90 standard days, each crew member is required to report to the scrub chambers on the middle deck for a mandatory psycho-mnemonic purge. The process is conducted by the ship's telepathica adepts, low-grade psykers who are themselves soul-bound and heavily warded. In practice, what this means is that they put you in a chair. They attach a series of neural probes to your temples and the base of your skull, and they methodically strip away any psychic residue that may have accumulated in your mind during your exposure to the containment holds. Psychic residue is the official term. What it actually means is that prolonged proximity to large numbers of psykers, even through warded walls and null fields, leaves traces in a baseline human mind. Faint impressions, echoes of thoughts that are not your own, emotional resonances with no connection to anything in your own experience. These traces are, according to the Telepathica, harmless individually, but cumulative exposure can lead to psychomnemonic contamination, which can lead to sympathetic resonance, which can lead to the crew member becoming a psyker themselves. I have been told that this progression has been documented. I have simply been told to sit in the chair and let the adepts do their work. The scrub itself is not painful, exactly. It is more like a subtraction. You go in feeling full, cluttered, and you come out feeling empty, lighter, but also less. Every scrub takes something with it, not just the psychic residue, but the memories entangled with it. Specific recollections fade, names become uncertain, faces blur. After 41 years and more scrubs than I can calculate, my personal history is a patchwork of clear moments and blank spaces. I remember the amber sky of Prothis Ven. I remember the girl with the ash-colored hair. I remember Knight Centura Seraleth's gauntleted hand on the old man's forehead. But I do not remember my mother's name. I do not remember if I had siblings. I do not remember the last thing I said before I boarded the shuttle that took me from Vrethis Hollow. The mind scrubs are presented as a necessary safeguard, and they are. But they are also a leash. A crew that cannot remember its past cannot long for it. A crew stripped of personal history has no identity outside the ship. We become the ship's property in a way more profound than any contract, because we lose the internal landmarks that would allow us to navigate back to who we were before. I have met wardens who have served longer than I have, and who cannot tell you what world they came from. The information is simply gone, excised by decades of scrubs. And in the absence of a somewhere else, there is only here. The ship, the work, the endless circuit from world to world, collecting the damned and delivering them to damnation. There is a hierarchy among the crew, of course. At the top is the seneschal, always a senior adept of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica. Our current seneschal is a woman named Tyvera Coel, who has held the position for 19 years and who governs the remittance with a quiet, merciless efficiency that I have come to respect, even as I find myself incapable of warmth toward her. She is a small woman, slight of build, with close-cropped silver hair and eyes of such a pale gray that they appear almost white. She never raises her voice. She simply states what will be done, and it is done, because every soul on this ship understands that the Seneschal's word is the word of the Astra Telepathica, and the Astra Telepathica's word is the word of the Emperor. Below the Seneschal are the ship's officers, the deckmasters, the armsmen captains, the tech adepts who maintain the remittance's ancient systems. There is the navigatrix, Pylothea of House Granicus, who occupies a position of unique authority and unique vulnerability. She is essential to the ship's function, the only being aboard capable of guiding us through the warp. And yet she is herself deeply psychic, and the null fields are a constant torment to her. She spends her time in a specially shielded blister at the prow, isolated by both architecture and temperament. I have spoken to her exactly 3 times in 41 years. Each time she looked at me as if she were seeing something behind my face that I could not see. There are the Sisters of Silence, who rotate through the ship in cadres of 6 to 12, depending on the mission cycle. They are not, strictly speaking, part of the crew. They are more like a permanent weather condition. When a cadre of sisters is aboard, the entire ship changes. The null fields intensify. The hum in the containment holds drops to a frequency that you feel in your teeth rather than your ears. And the crew gives them a wide berth, not from discourtesy, but from instinct. The paria gene does not merely negate psychic energy. It creates an aura of wrongness that affects every living being in proximity. Standing near a Sister of Silence is like standing near a hole in the world. Your mind tells you that something is missing, something fundamental, and it recoils. I have seen hardened wardens, men who have walked the containment holds for decades without flinching, cross to the other side of a corridor to avoid passing within arm's reach of a sister. This is not cowardice. It is biology. The human soul recognizes the absence of another soul, and it fears that absence the way a fire fears water. There is one sister in the current cadre who concerns me. Her designation translates roughly as veiled calcis. She is tall, angular, with the pale, almost translucent complexion common to those who carry the pariah gene, and she watches me. Not openly, not in a way that anyone else has noticed, but I feel her attention the way you feel a draft from an open window, a directional coldness that finds me in corridors, on the walkways above the holds. More than once I have turned a corner to find her standing at the far end of a passageway, motionless, her eyes fixed on me with an expression that is not hostility, but assessment. The way a hunter studies tracks that do not match any species she recognizes. And here is what troubles me most. Her aura affects me more than it should. The other wardens feel the standard discomfort around the sisters. I feel pain. A sharp, bright ache behind my eyes, a ringing in my ears, a sensation of something inside me being pressed flat, compressed, denied room to breathe. It is the same sensation I feel near the reliquary, only sharper, more personal, her null field reaching into me and finding something there that should not exist in a baseline human. She has never reported me. She simply watches and waits, and I think she knows what I am before I know it myself. I think of a man I worked with for many years, Brenthal, the warden who vomited blood on Prothis Ven. He was a good man as far as such things can be measured in a place like this. Steady, reliable, not prone to the fits of existential despair that claim so many of our number. He had a habit of humming to himself while he walked his rounds, a low, tuneless drone that was probably some half-remembered melody from his homeworld, though neither of us could have told you what world that was. After 23 years of service, Brenthal stopped humming. He did not do it deliberately. It just stopped the way a clock stops when its mechanism has worn out. A few months later, he stopped speaking except when spoken to. A few months after that, he stopped meeting anyone's eyes. The medici officers examined him and found nothing wrong. The Telepathica adepts conducted an emergency scrub and declared him clean of contamination. But Brenthal was gone. Whatever had been the essential Brenthal, the thing that hummed and nodded, and occasionally, in the mess hall late at night, told fragments of jokes that never had punchlines, that thing had been worn away. He was still alive, he still performed his duties. He walked his rounds and checked his cells and reported his findings in clipped, accurate sentences. But there was nothing behind the words. He was a mechanism performing a function, and the person who had once inhabited that mechanism had departed without leaving a forwarding address. They transferred him to surface-side processing after that, a ground-side role on some tithe world where he would spend his remaining years supervising collection points and never again set foot aboard a vessel. It was presented as a reassignment. It was an act of mercy, which is a thing the black ships rarely traffic in, and the fact that they showed it to Brenthal suggests that even the seneschal recognized that something in him had been consumed beyond recovery. I think about Brenthal often, not because we were friends, though I suppose we were, in the attenuated way that men on a black ship can be friends. I think about him because I have been doing this work longer than he did, and I have not stopped humming. I have not stopped speaking. I have not stopped meeting people's eyes. And the question that keeps me awake during my rest cycles, the question that the mind scrubs have never been able to erase is why? Why am I still intact? After 41 years of null field exposure, 41 years of walking the containment holds, 41 years of the drip, Why has the ship not worn me down the way it wore down Brenthal and 100 other wardens before him? What is different about me? The answer, I suspect, is one I am not meant to know, and the fact that I suspect it at all suggests that the scrubs are not working as well as they used to. But let me tell you first about the cargo, because I have been speaking about cells and holds and ward work, and I have not yet told you what it is really like to be the man who locks the door and walks away. The sable remittance can hold approximately 2,000 psykers at full capacity, distributed across the 13 containment holds. More typically, we carry between 12 and 1,500, the numbers fluctuating as we collect from some worlds and lose others to transit casualties. Transit casualties is the official term for psykers who die during the voyage. Somewhere between 5 and 15% of the cargo does not survive the journey to Terra. Some die from the null field exposure itself, their minds unable to endure the sustained severance from the Imperium. Some die from the physical privations of containment, some die by their own hand, and some die from what the Telepathica adepts call spontaneous psychic collapse, which is a polite way of saying that the thing inside them turns inward and devours them from the inside out. I have been present for such events. I have watched through the observation slit as a man's body twisted and contorted in ways that no human skeleton should permit, his flesh rippling as the psychic energy that had been bottled up by the null fields found a channel of least resistance, and that channel was his own biology. I have seen a child sit perfectly still and then simply cease to exist, not violently, not dramatically, just a gradual fading, like a pixed image losing resolution, until the cell was empty and the biometric monitors showed a flat line, and there was nothing left to show that a human being had ever been there. These events are logged, catalogued, and filed. The cargo number is updated. The cell is cleaned, rewarded, and prepared for the next occupant. The work continues. But not all of the cargo is passive. Not all of them surrender to the null fields and the darkness and the slow erosion of self. Some of them fight, and when a psyker fights aboard a black ship, the consequences can be catastrophic. I remember a transit, perhaps 15 years ago, though the scrubs have made the timeline uncertain. We were carrying a full complement, including a young man from a world called Essengrave, a Forge World subsidiary in the segmentum Tempestus. His name, according to the manifest, was Dorthin Alt, though I learned later that this was likely not his birth name, but a designation assigned by the Arbites who collected him. He was classified as a high-grade telepath, Zeta level on the psychic assignment scale, which placed him well above the threshold for sacrifice and into the range where soul-binding and sanctioned service were possibilities. He was also, as I discovered during my rounds, remarkably resistant to the null fields. Most psykers in the holds became docile within days, their abilities suppressed, their personalities flattened by the constant pressure. Dorthin Alt did not. He sat in his cell with his back straight and his eyes open, and when I looked through the slit, he looked back. There was no defiance in his gaze, and no madness, only patience. He was waiting for something. I reported this to the shift master, who reported it to the seneschal, who ordered increased monitoring and an additional ward layer on his cell door. Standard precaution, nothing to be concerned about. 3 weeks into the transit, during a particularly violent warp storm that had the navigatrix screaming in her blister and the Gellar Fields flickering like a dying lumen, Dorthin Alt reached out. Not physically. He sat in his cell in the dark, and he projected. The null fields should have made this impossible. The wards should have contained any emission. But somehow, through some combination of raw talent and desperate will, He sent a pulse of psychic energy that passed through the cell walls, through the wardwork, through the deck plates, and into the minds of every living being on the lower 3 decks of the sable remittance. I was on the walkway above Hold 7 when it hit me. It was not a message. It was not an attack. It was a question broadcast with such force and such clarity that I heard it as if it were spoken aloud, in a voice that was simultaneously his and not his, a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, from inside and outside, from the past and the future simultaneously. The question was simple. It was 4 words. Where are we going? The answer for Dorthin Alt and for most of the souls aboard was the same. Terra, the Golden Throne, the Astronomicon, the light that guides the ships of the Imperium through the warp, the light that holds the darkness at bay, the light that burns with the stolen fire of 1,000 psykers sacrificed each and every day to keep the Emperor alive and the beacon lit. That is where we were going. That is where we were always going. The pulse lasted perhaps 2 seconds before the null fields reasserted themselves and crushed it. But in those 2 seconds, the containment holds erupted. Psykers who had been silent for weeks began screaming again, not in pain but in response, answering the question in a cacophony of voices and languages and psychic emissions that overloaded 3 ward arrays and caused a cascade failure in Hold 9 that took the tech adepts 6 hours to repair. 2 wardens on the lower walkway of Hold 12 collapsed and did not regain consciousness for 3 days. The ship's astropath, Califex, had a seizure so violent that his attendants thought he was dead. And in Hold 7, where Dorthin Alt sat in his darkened cell, the observation slit glowed with a faint, cool light that had no source and cast no shadows. I was the one they sent in. That is part of the warden's job, the part they do not mention during the testing on Vrethus Hollow. When a psyker breaches containment, even partially, even for an instant, someone has to go in and assess the situation. Make sure the subject is still viable, still intact, still worth delivering to Terra. That someone is the cell warden on duty, and that day, the cell warden on duty was me. I unsealed the door. I stepped inside. And Dorthin Alt looked up at me from his place on the floor, and he smiled. And he said in a voice that was perfectly calm and perfectly steady, and utterly unlike the voice that had spoken inside my mind moments before, "You felt it, did you not? You heard the question, and you wanted to answer. I could feel you wanting to answer, Warden. Your mind was the loudest one on this ship." I told him to be silent. I checked his restraints. I left the cell. I sealed the door. I reported that the subject was contained and that the breach had been resolved. I did not report what he had said to me. I did not report that, in the moment of the pulse, I had not merely heard the question. I had understood it, not as a series of words transmitted into my mind, but as a concept, a shape, a pattern that I recognized in the way you recognize your own face in a mirror, intimately, instinctively, as if the question had been asked in my own language, a language I did not know I spoke. The next morning, when I reported for my shift, I was informed that I was scheduled for an emergency mind scrub, unscheduled, off-cycle. The adepts were apologetic in their bland, professional way. Routine precaution, they said. You were exposed to a psychic breach, standard protocol. I sat in the chair. I felt the probes against my temples. And when I stood up again, the memory of what Dorthin Alt had said to me was gone. Just gone. A blank space where a conversation had been. I knew that something had happened in the cell because the duty log recorded my entry and exit, but the content of the encounter was erased as thoroughly as if it had never occurred. I know this only because I wrote it down. Before the scrub, in the hours between the breach and the appointment, I sat at the fold-down shelf in my quarters and I wrote it down on a slip of recycled parchment, and I folded it very small, and I placed it inside the lining of my boot, in a gap between the insole and the sole plate that I had discovered years ago and had never mentioned to anyone. The scrubs take what is in your mind. They cannot take what is in your boot. It is, I think, the only act of genuine rebellion I have ever committed aboard this ship, and I did it on instinct, without deliberation, as if some part of me understood that this memory was important, that it was a piece of a puzzle that I was not supposed to be assembling, and that losing it would be losing something I could not afford to lose. I have other slips of paper in that boot, accumulated over years, written in the hours before scheduled scrubs, recording things I could not bear to forget. Fragments, observations, things that passengers have said to me, things that do not add up. But before I tell you what they add up to, you need to understand the journey. The transit to Terra. What happens when the holds are full and the sable remittance turns her blunt prow toward Sol. The transit from the outer reaches of the remittances circuit back to the Sol system takes, on average, between 4 and 8 months of real space-time. In warp time, it could be days or decades. The relationship between the two is not linear, not predictable, and not something that any sane person dwells upon. What matters is the experience of the journey, and the experience of the journey is this: a full complement of 1,500 psykers crammed into containment holds that were designed for efficiency rather than humanity, slowly being ground down by null fields and darkness, and the knowledge shared among them in whatever residual psychic whisper the wards cannot fully suppress, that most of them are going to die. The holds change when they are full. I have walked them empty during the short intervals between delivery and the start of a new collection cycle, and empty, they are merely oppressive, cold iron and warding smoke, and that low subsonic hum that is always present. But full, the holds become something else, something alive. The hum intensifies, thickens, acquires layers and textures that shift with the emotional state of the cargo, new voices joining a chorus that has been building for millennia. When the psykers are afraid, the hum rises in pitch, becomes a whine that sits behind your eyes like a needle. When they are despairing, it drops, becomes a bass vibration that you feel in your marrow, in the roots of your teeth, in the soles of your feet, through the grated walkways. When they are angry, and there are moments of collective anger, brief surges that sweep through the holds like a weather front. The hum spikes, and the wards flare with visible light, pale blue and sickly yellow, and the sensors swing wildly on their chains, and every warden on duty feels a surge of adrenaline that has nothing to do with any physical threat, and everything to do with the sudden, overwhelming awareness that we are standing in the middle of an ocean of compressed psychic fury. And the only thing holding it back is metal and faith, and wards that are 9,000 years old, and were not designed for the psychic density of the 41st millennium. The night cycles are the worst. The remittance maintains an artificial day-night rhythm for the benefit of the crew, dimming the lumens on a standardized 24-hour schedule, though the void outside the hull knows no such distinction. During the night cycle, when the corridors are dim and the duty shifts are skeleton-crewed, the containment holds become a place of sounds that I do not have adequate words to describe. The weeping, for one. A constant low-level background of human misery, dozens or hundreds of people crying simultaneously, the individual voices merging into a single, undifferentiated wash of grief that echoes off the warded walls and seems to come from everywhere at once. It is not loud. It is the opposite of loud. It is intimate, pervasive, inescapable. The ship itself seems to be crying, mourning something it lost so long ago that it cannot remember what it was, and beneath the weeping and above it, and threaded through it like dark thread through dark cloth, the hum, always the hum, Occasionally, during the night cycle, someone in the holds will begin to sing. Not a song exactly, a toneless, drifting sequence of notes that has no structure and no resolution, the singer channeling something that exists in the space between the wards and the Imperium, where suppressed psychic energy pools and seeks an outlet. Other voices join, not deliberately. One by one across the holds, the cargo picks up the non-song, layers their voices atop one another in a harmony that is deeply discordant, and yet which has a coherence that defies its dissonance. The wardens call this the choir, and it is perhaps the most unsettling thing I have ever experienced aboard this ship. The choir happens once or twice per transit. The Telepathica adepts have concluded that it is a spontaneous resonance event in which the suppressed abilities of the cargo find partial expression through sound. The wards cannot fully suppress it because it is physical, air moving through larynxes, vibrating vocal cords. But the content encoded in those sequences of notes is not mundane at all. During the choir events, Califex goes catatonic. The navigatrix retreats into the deepest shielding of her blister. The Sisters of Silence are the only ones unaffected, standing in the corridors with their usual expressionless composure, while the rest of us fight the urge to press our hands over our ears, and the deeper, more disturbing urge to join in. I have felt that urge. I want to be honest about that. During the choir events, standing on the walkway above Hold 7, with my shock maul in my hand and my helm sealed against the sound, I have felt something inside me reach toward the voices, straining like a plant toward light, desperate to add its own note to the collective. It is not a thought. It is not a decision. It is a reflex, a pull, as involuntary as a heartbeat, and it terrifies me more than anything else on this ship, because reflexes come from somewhere, and the somewhere this reflex comes from is a place I am not supposed to have access to. There are other things that happen during transit that I should mention, because they are part of the texture of life aboard a black ship, part of the slow accumulation of horror that defines this existence. The Gellar Field failures, for instance. Every ship that travels through the warp relies on its Gellar Field to maintain a bubble of stable reality around the vessel, keeping the madness of the Imperium at bay. On a normal ship, a Gellar Field fluctuation is a crisis. On a black ship, it is an apocalypse in waiting, because the cargo in the holds is not merely human. It is a beacon, a vast, compressed mass of psychic energy that calls to the entities of the warp, the way blood calls to predators. During the transit I mentioned earlier, the one with Dorthan Alt, the Gellar Field flickered for approximately 9 seconds. 9 seconds. In those 9 seconds, something pressed against the hull of the sable remittance from the outside. Not physically. The hull sensors registered no impact, no contact, no mass. But every psyker in the holds screamed simultaneously, a wall of sound so total and so anguished that it overloaded the acoustic dampeners on 3 decks, and the wards on the outer bulkhead of Hold 13 flared so bright that the wardens on duty were temporarily blinded. When the Gellar Field restabilized, there were scratch marks on the inside of 27 cells, scratched by the occupants. All 27 had scratched the same symbol, independently, simultaneously, in cells scattered across 6 different holds. The Telepathica adepts classified the symbol as a spontaneous psychographic resonance event and ordered it filed. I saw the symbol. I do not know what it meant, but I recognized it in the way you recognize a face you have seen in a dream, and that recognition sat in my stomach like a cold stone for weeks, until the next mind scrub softened its edges. But there was a second Gellar fluctuation during that same transit, 3 days later, that I have never spoken of to anyone. It came during the night cycle. I was walking my rounds in Hold 6, alone. The field did not merely flicker this time, it dropped. completely. For perhaps 4 seconds, the sable remittance was bare to the warp, and the holds erupted in a psychic scream that was not a scream, but a summons, a vast involuntary beacon flaring in the immaterium, and something answered. I felt it through whatever the mind scrubs had been suppressing, an intelligence, vast and hungry and utterly alien, pressing against the hull, testing the warded metal, and I felt it find the holds, and I felt it begin to push through. The psykers in the cells around me began convulsing. 3 of them were manifesting simultaneously, their suppressed abilities roaring back to life in the absence of the Gellar Field, and the wardwork on the cell doors was glowing white-hot, and the air tasted of copper and static and something sweet and rotten underneath. And I did something that a baseline human cannot do. I reached out, not physically, not consciously, with the thing inside me that heard the hum and understood the question and resonated with the reliquary. I did not fight the thing pressing against the hull. I could not have. I am a spark, not a bonfire. But I reached toward the psykers in the cells around me, the 3 who were manifesting, and I did something that I can only describe as leaning against them, a psychic steadying, a hand on a shoulder in the dark. I do not know what it felt like from their side, but from mine it felt like gripping a railing in a storm, holding on with everything I had while the deck pitched beneath me. The convulsions slowed, the wardwork cooled from white to blue, and when the Gellar Field snapped back into place, Hold 6 was intact. The other holds reported casualties, Hold 6 reported none. The shift master praised my quick response, assuming I had activated some emergency protocol. I had not activated anything. I had simply stood in the dark and steadied people I was not supposed to be able to reach, with an ability I was not supposed to possess. I think often of a particular woman we collected from a world called Pelene Tertius, an agri world in the segmentum Pacificus. Her name on the manifest was Gavra, and she was unusual among our cargo in that she was old. Most psykers are collected young. The older ones have typically either been dealt with by local authorities or have learned to hide. Gavra was in her 70s, frail, white-haired, with the bent spine and calloused hands of a lifelong farmer. And she was a telepath of staggering, barely contained power. When Califex assessed her, he sent a message to the Seneschal that I was not supposed to see. Epsilon grade, possibly Delta. How she has remained undiscovered for this long defies all actuarial models. Handle with utmost caution. Epsilon grade in an untrained woman who had spent 7 decades harvesting grain. She had lived her entire life with a door in her mind that could have opened onto the immaterium at any moment, and through some combination of iron will and simple ignorance, she had kept it closed. She did not know what she was. She thought the voices she heard were saints. Her faith had been her containment field, more effective than any ward or null emitter, and now that the null fields were pressing against her mind, her faith was crumbling and the thing inside her was waking up. I watched her through the observation slit for weeks. She prayed, constantly, ceaselessly, her lips moving in an unbroken stream of devotion, the words of the imperial creed tumbling from her mouth like water from a spring, and I could see in the way her hands trembled and her eyes widened and her breath came faster with each passing day, that the prayers were not bringing her peace. They were becoming a wall, a frantic, desperate wall against something that was pressing from the other side, and the wall was thinning. On the 32nd day of her containment, the prayers stopped. She sat in her cell, silent, motionless, her eyes open and fixed on a point approximately 3 centimeters in front of her face, and she did not move for 6 hours. The biometric monitors showed her vitals as steady, impossibly steady, the kind of physiological stasis that the Medici officers associate with deep meditation or with something else entirely. When she finally moved, she turned her head toward the observation slit, toward me, and she said in a voice that was calm and clear and utterly without fear, "You poor boy. They have you in a cage you cannot even see. Epsilon grade, possibly Delta. The null fields had dimmed her gift, but they had not extinguished it. Where lesser psykers saw only the warden's visor and the black armor, Gavra Sul looked deeper, and she saw the spark that the mind scrubs had been trying to smother for decades. She died that night. The Medikey report listed the cause as cardiac arrest, which is the standard euphemism for psychic collapse in a containment environment. But I was on duty when it happened, and I looked through the slit, and what I saw was not a woman dying of heart failure. What I saw was a woman letting go, deliberately, consciously, opening the door that she had held closed for 70 years and stepping through it, not because she had lost her faith, but because her faith had finally shown her where the door led, and she was not afraid. The light that came from her cell lasted perhaps 3 seconds. It was not the harsh, violent light of a psychic breach. It was warm, golden. It filled the cell like sunrise on a world with a yellow star, and for those 3 seconds, the hum in Hold 4 changed its character entirely, became something that was not a lament and not a prayer, but something else, something that I do not have a word for, something that felt like forgiveness. And then it was gone, and the cell was empty, and the biometric monitor showed a flat line, and I stood on the walkway and felt the tears on my face, and did not know why I was crying. I think she was the strongest person I have ever encountered. Not because of her psychic grade, but because she chose. In a place designed to strip away every choice, every dignity, every shred of agency, she chose how to leave. And the ship, the great black machine of negation and despair, could not prevent that choice, could not contain it, could not reduce it to a cargo number and a biometric flatline. For 3 seconds, Gavra Sul was free, and the ship knew it, and I think the ship was afraid. Here is the thing I could not explain then and can barely explain now. The hum in Hold 4 changed after Gavra died. Not temporarily the way it shifts during a choir event or a psychic incident. Permanently. There is a note in it now that was not there before, a warm, low tone, almost inaudible, that I can pick out from the rest, the way you can pick out a single instrument in an orchestra, once you have learned to listen for it. It is her. I am as certain of this as I am of anything. Gavra Sul died in that cell, and her body was removed and cremated per standard protocol, and her cargo number was updated, and the cell was cleaned and rewarded for the next occupant. But something of her stayed, something that the wards could not contain because it was not trying to escape. It was choosing to remain. And when I walk past her old cell during the night cycle, I hear that note swell, just slightly, and within it, so faint I might be imagining it, 4 words that are becoming the constant refrain of this ship, the question that the living and the dead ask together in the dark. Where are we going? I used to think it was despair. Now I am not sure. I told you earlier that I would explain the pattern, the collection of slips hidden in my boot, the observations that the mind scrubs have tried and failed to erase. Here is what the pattern looks like, assembled from fragments over decades. One of the oldest slips reads, "Cargo in Hold 4 called me brother today. Not warden. Brother." He was looking at me through the slit, and he said it like a fact, not a plea. Why do they keep seeing something in me? Do not forget this. Another, in shakier handwriting, the sister watched me again. She flinched when I passed. Sisters do not flinch. What am I? The earliest piece is this. I have served aboard the Sable Remittance longer than any other current crew member. 41 years. The average service life of a black ship warden before psychological incapacitation is 14 years. The longest-serving warden in the remittance's recent history, before me, was a woman named Ossica Grent, who lasted 26 years before she began speaking in tongues and had to be sedated and shipped to a sanitarium on a moon orbiting Neptune. I have surpassed her by 15 years, and I show no signs of deterioration. The Telepathica adepts have noted this. The Seneschal has noted this. They do not discuss it with me, but I have read the notations on my service record during a moment when the data scribe's terminal was left unattended. Anomalous resilience. Recommend continued observation. Do not transfer. Then there is the hum. I hear it more clearly than anyone else on the crew, and that clarity is not a matter of volume. The interference, the distortion that the wards impose on the sound, does not seem to apply to my perception of it. Other wardens describe the hum as a vague, formless vibration. I hear tones, sequences, structures that shift and change in response to the state of the cargo, and if I listen carefully, if I let my attention settle into the hum the way you settle into a warm bath, I can sometimes discern individual voices within it. The psychic signature of a specific person, as distinct and recognizable as a face. And I can match that signature to a cell number. And I can tell you, without checking the biometric monitors, whether the person in that cell is sleeping or awake, calm or distressed, alive or on the threshold of death. And the instinct, if instinct is even the right word, I know when the cargo is going to cause trouble with a specificity that I cannot explain through experience alone. I knew that Dorthan Alt was going to breach containment before he did it. Not consciously, not in a way I could have articulated as a warning. But I felt it, a tightening in my chest, a metallic taste on my tongue, a certainty that something was about to happen in Hold 7, and I was already moving toward his cell when the pulse hit. This has happened before, dozens of times. I have been in the right place at the right time so often that the shift masters have started assigning me to the most volatile holds as a matter of course, because, as one of them put it, Mon has a nose for trouble. A nose. That is what they think it is. Instinct. Experience. A nose. And then there is the thing I have never written down, that I have never committed to parchment, because writing it makes it real in a way that thinking it does not. The reliquary calls to me. Not metaphorically. Not in the sense that I find it intellectually fascinating or professionally concerning. It calls to me the way a moth is called by a flame, the way a river is called by the sea. When I pass its sealed door, something inside me leans toward it, and the lean is not reluctance or curiosity. It is recognition, as if the thing inside that room, the null field generator or the weapon, or whatever it truly is, knows me, and I know it. And the conversation we are having, below the threshold of language, below the threshold of thought, has been going on for years. Here is what the pattern tells me. Here is the shape that emerges when I lay out all the slips of paper from my boot and read them in sequence, from the oldest, written in the hand of a younger man whose handwriting I barely recognize, to the most recent, written last night in the dim lumen light of my quarters, after everyone else on the middle deck was asleep. The pattern tells me that the mind scrubs are not removing psychic contamination from my mind. They are suppressing something that was already there. The pattern tells me that my anomalous resilience, my ability to hear the hum, my instinct for trouble, my resonance with the reliquary, are not the traits of an exceptionally hardy baseline human. They are the traits of something else. Something that the sable remittance identified when I was 17 years old and subjected to the intake tests on Vrethus Hollow. Something that the Astra Telepathica decided not to put in a cell but instead put in a uniform, because a low-grade psyker who does not know he is a psyker, whose abilities are suppressed and channeled by regular mind scrubs, who has been conditioned by decades of service to think of himself as a tool rather than a person, is more useful as a warden than as fuel. I am cargo. I have always been cargo. The only difference between me and the souls in the cells below my feet is that my cell is the entire ship, and my containment field is ignorance, and my sentence is not the quick burning of the Astronomicon, but the slow burning of a life spent in service to a machine that I did not know I was part of. This is what I believe. This is what the slips of paper have led me to over years and decades, one fragment at a time, assembled in the gaps between scrubs, pieced together with the shaking hands of a man who is discovering that the floor he has been standing on is not solid ground but a very thin layer of metal over a very deep void. I reached this conclusion 12 days ago. Sat on my cot during the night cycle, the slips spread around me like the pieces of a cipher, and I read them in order, and the shape they made was unmistakable, and I said it aloud to no one in the dark of my quarters. I am cargo. The words hung in the recycled air like a sentence passed, and I knew with the same certainty that tells me when a psyker is about to breach containment that something would come of my knowing, that the ship would notice, that it always notices. And here is the thing that happened 3 days ago, which is the reason I am telling you all of this now, recording these words into the ship's secondary log system, using a maintenance override code that I should not know but do, because I stood behind a tech adept in the corridor 3 days ago, and the code surfaced in my mind like a bubble rising through water, plucked from his thoughts without either of us intending it. Another symptom of a suppression that is no longer holding. 3 days ago, during the morning shift change, Seneschal Cole summoned me to her offices on the upper deck. This has happened before, occasionally, for performance reviews or operational briefings. But when I arrived, the Seneschal was not alone. There was an Inquisitor in the room, a tall, gaunt man in dark robes, with the rosette of the Ordo Hereticus displayed openly on his chest, and eyes that were the color of warp-tainted ice. His name, the Seneschal told me, was Hesvik Droon, and he had been traveling with the remittance for the past 6 months, which was news to me, because I had never seen him, never heard his name mentioned, and the fact that an Inquisitor had been aboard for half a year without my knowledge suggested either extraordinary operational security or deliberate concealment from specific members of the crew. Inquisitor Droon did not waste time on pleasantries. He told me, in a voice that was soft and precise and devoid of warmth, that the Astra Telepathica's records indicated that I was originally catalogued on Vrethis Hollow as a Psi Rho candidate. Psi Rho, the lowest detectable grade of psychic potential, so low that it barely registers on the assignment scale, so low that a person possessing it would never manifest any overt psychic ability, would never pose a threat of demonic incursion, would never be worth the resource expenditure of transport to Terra for sacrifice. But not zero, not null. Not the clean, flat absence of psychic potential that the intake tests are supposed to confirm before a recruit is assigned to the crew. He told me that the decision to assign me as a warden rather than classifying me as cargo was made 41 years ago by a Telepathica adept on Vrethis Hollow, who recognized that a Psi Rho operative, properly managed through regular psychomnemonic suppression, would make an ideal containment warden. My abilities, such as they were, gave me an unconscious sensitivity to psychic fluctuations that no baseline human could match. A living sensor unit embedded in the cell block, more reliable than any cogitator and cheaper to maintain. The mind scrubs were not removing contamination, they were maintaining suppression. Keeping my abilities tamped down, functional but unrecognized, a tool that did not know it was a tool. He told me this the way you tell someone what is for dinner. Factually, without emphasis, without apology. I told him I already knew. He paused, and for the first time since I had entered the room, something shifted in his expression. Not surprise, exactly. Interest. He asked me how. I told him about the slips in my boot, the decades of fragments, the pattern. He looked at the seneschal, and I saw something pass between them, a communication that had no words, but that told me everything I needed to know about Tivara Cole's role in my story. She had known. Of course she had known. She was seneschal of a black ship, responsible for every soul aboard. The idea that she would not have been informed of a psychically active warden operating in her containment holds was absurd. She had known, and she had kept me. Not out of kindness, not out of cruelty, out of utility. I was a tool that functioned better than any replacement, and so she had authorized the increased scrub frequency, and she had ensured my assignment to the most volatile holds, and she had written "Do not transfer" on my service record, and she had done all of this with the same quiet, merciless efficiency with which she governed everything else. When I looked at her, she met my eyes, and she said in a voice that was entirely steady, "You have served well, Moan, better than any warden in this ship's history. That is not nothing. It was the closest thing to an apology I was ever going to receive, and it was not an apology at all. It was a performance review." Droon continued. He told me that I was not the first Psy-Ro operative deployed in this manner, that the practice was rare but documented, and that most such operatives lasted a decade or less before the suppression failed, and they had to be reassigned. He mentioned almost casually the name Dorthan Alt. I felt something tighten in my chest. Droon said that Alt had been subjected to soul binding upon arrival at Terra, that his Zeta-level power had made him a viable candidate, and that the process had been successful. Alt was alive. Alt was serving as a sanctioned astropath somewhere in the Segmentum Pacificus, blind and bound and transmitting the Emperor's messages across the stars. The man who had asked, "Where are we going?" had arrived, and he had survived, and he was still carrying voices from one end of the galaxy to the other. I did not know whether to find this comforting or horrifying. I still do not. Then he told me the rest. He told me that the suppression had been degrading for the past several years, that my abilities, stimulated by decades of proximity to high-grade psykers in the containment holds, had been growing. Slowly but measurably despite the increased frequency of the scrubs, that the Telepathica adepts had flagged my case 18 months ago, and that his presence aboard the remittance was, in part, to make a determination regarding my continued assignment. But there was more to it than that. My knowing, my independent discovery of my own nature, had accelerated the timeline. A tool that knows it is a tool, Droon said, is either a more useful tool or a dangerous one. We are here to determine which. And I understood suddenly why Veiled Calcis had never reported me. She was part of this. Another instrument in the assessment, deployed to watch the anomaly and measure how quickly it was becoming aware of itself. Not my enemy. My mirror. I asked him what the alternatives were. He looked at me with those ice-colored eyes, and he said, "There are only ever two alternatives for your kind, Warden Moon. Service or sacrament." Service meant soul binding. A chance, slim and brutal, to have my mind torn open and reshaped by the psychic will of the Emperor himself, to emerge, if I survived, as a low-grade sanctioned psyker, perhaps assigned back to a black ship in an official capacity, perhaps sent to some other branch of the Imperium's vast machinery. The soul binding would destroy my sight. It might destroy more. The survival rate for someone of my age and grade was, he admitted, not encouraging. Sacrament meant the Astronomicon, the choir of fire, the light that never goes out, fed by the burning souls of 1,000 psykers every single day, day after day, millennium after millennium, since the Emperor was interred on the Golden Throne. I would be strapped to a device. My mind would be opened forcibly, irrevocably, and the psychic energy that I carried, that small, quiet, persistent spark that the mind scrubs had been trying to smother for 41 years, would be drawn out of me and poured into the beacon, and I would burn, and the light would shine a fraction brighter for a fraction of a second, and then I would be gone. Not dead. Gone. There is a difference. The dead leave behind bodies and memories and the fading echoes of who they were. The souls consumed by the Astronomicon leave behind nothing. They are fuel. They are consumed. They cease. I asked him how long I had. He said the decision would be made when we reached Terra. 6 weeks, by the navigatrix's estimate. 6 weeks to continue walking my rounds, checking my cells, listening to the hum that I now understood was not the ship speaking to me, but my own suppressed abilities resonating with the cargo, a frequency I had always shared but had never been allowed to recognize. He dismissed me. I returned to the middle deck. I walked to my quarters. I sat on my cot, and I reached into my boot, and I pulled out the slips of paper. All of them. Years of fragments and observations and half-understood truths, and I read them one after another in the dim light, and everything, every single thing made sense. The girl on Prothis Ven. You can hear it too, can you not? She had known. A child, terrified and doomed, and she had looked at me and seen what the mind scrubs had hidden. What I had hidden from myself. Dorthan Alt, your mind was the loudest one on this ship. Not the loudest warden, not the loudest baseline human, the loudest mind. Because I was not baseline. I had never been baseline. I was a candle burning in a room full of bonfires, too dim to notice in the conflagration, but burning all the same. The hum. My ability to hear it, to parse it, to identify individual voices within it. It was never talent, it was never experience, it was a shared language, a kinship. I am kin to the cargo. I have always been kin to the cargo, and the ship, the great black-warded cathedral of negation, has known this from the beginning, and it has used me, and it has used me well. And now that I am no longer useful in my current configuration, it will use me in the only way it knows how to use what I am. I will burn, or I will be broken and remade. Those are my options. 6 weeks. I am recording this because I want someone to know. None of this will change because one warden discovered that he was never a warden at all. But I want the words to exist somewhere that the mind scrubs cannot reach. 41 years, a uniform and a shock maul and a purpose that was never mine. I performed my function admirably, and the function consumed me the same way the Astronomicon consumes its fuel, slowly, over a lifetime instead of an instant, but with the same end result. The light. Let me talk about the light, because the light is the reason all of this exists. The Astronomicon. The psychic beacon that shines in the warp, that guides every starship in the Imperium to its destination, that is the golden thread connecting a million worlds. Without it, there is no interstellar travel. Without travel, there is no Imperium. Without the Imperium, there is only the darkness, and the things that live in the darkness, and the unthinkable horror of a galaxy in which humanity is alone and undefended against the predators of the warp. The Astronomicon requires 1,000 psykers every day. That number has been increasing. The warp has grown more turbulent. The Great Rift has torn the galaxy in two, and the beacon must burn brighter to be seen through the storm. More psykers, more black ships, more shadows falling across more worlds, more children with ash-colored hair sitting in collection points, waiting for the hand that will take them from everything they know and deliver them to a fire that never goes out. This is the necessity. The math is simple. The math is horrifying. And the cruelest part is that many of them accept it. They accept it because belief is the one thing the null fields cannot suppress, the one fire that no ward can extinguish, and they carry it with them into the cells and through the transit and down the long corridor to the golden throne, and they burn with it willingly because they believe that their suffering has meaning. I do not know if it has meaning. But last night, standing in Hold 4 near the cell where Gavra died, I heard something in the hum that made me stop breathing. A voice, thinner, younger than Gavra's warm tone, with the ghost of an accent that might have belonged to a girl raised under an amber sky. It said nothing I could resolve into words, but the feeling it carried was unmistakable. Someone looking at me through an observation slit that no longer exists, saying very quietly, "You can hear it too, can you not?" The same words, across years and light years and the immolation of the Astronomicon. Still asking, still knowing. 6 weeks, the sable remittance pushes through the warp, her ancient hull groaning, her wards flickering, her holds full of souls that will feed the fire. And I walk my rounds, I check my cells, I listen to the hum, and now that I know what the hum is, now that I understand that it is the sound of my kinship with the condemned, I hear it differently. I hear it as what it has always been, a lament, a prayer, a question asked in a language that only the damned can speak, repeated over and over in the darkness, echoing off warded walls that were built to contain it, but were never able to silence it entirely. Where are we going? We are going where we have always been going. All of us. Crew and cargo, warden and prisoner, the watchers and the watched. We are going to Terra. We are going to the light. And whether that light is salvation or annihilation depends entirely on which side of the observation slit you are standing on when the ship makes port. I used to think I knew which side I was on. Now I know that there is no slit. There is no division. There is only the ship and the silence and the fire at the end of the voyage, and every soul aboard is fuel. Every last one of us. My name is Edroth Moan. For 41 years I walked the black corridors and told myself I was the lock. Turns out I was just another door they had not yet decided to open. 6 weeks to Terra. The hum is louder tonight, but I am not going to Terra. I need to tell you what happened an hour ago because it changes everything, and because after I finish speaking, I am going to do something that no one on this ship will understand, and I want there to be a record. I want someone someday to know why. I went to the reliquary, not on duty, not on orders. During the night cycle, when the walkways were empty and the wardens on shift were 3 holds away, I walked to the sealed door at the heart of the containment section. I had always assumed it was locked, sealed by some mechanism I did not understand. Every warden assumed that. But standing before it now, with the suppression crumbling and my abilities stirring like a sleeper waking, I understood something I had never understood before. The door was not locked. It had never been locked. It was simply unapproachable. What I had always perceived as the reliquary's devastating null field, the thing that made every soul on this ship recoil from the room, was not a null field at all. It was psychic resonance, so dense, so layered, so ancient, that an untrained mind read it as absence the way an ear overwhelmed by sound perceives deafness. The wardens could not approach because their baseline minds interpreted the signal as annihilating emptiness. The psykers in the holds could not approach because the wards channeled the resonance away from them. But I had spent 41 years attuned to this ship's frequency, my own suppressed abilities harmonizing with the hum until my mind had calibrated itself, unconsciously, incrementally, to the exact wavelength that the reliquary broadcast. I reached out, not with my hand, with the thing inside me, and the door opened because I was the frequency it had been waiting for. I stepped inside. The room was exactly as the senior wardens had described it. Circular, 30 meters across, smooth floor, domed ceiling, a single dead lumen fixture overhead. Empty, featureless. And the null field, the crushing, soul-flattening pressure that I had felt from outside for decades, was gone. Not diminished. Gone. Replaced by something else entirely. Something that was not null at all. The room was full of voices. Not sound, not psychic projection. Something in between, something that existed in the same space as the hum but magnified 1,000-fold, so dense and so layered that it had been misread by every instrument and every mind that had ever stood near the reliquary as an absence, because the human mind, confronted with a signal of that magnitude, interprets it as silence the same way the eye, confronted with all colors simultaneously, perceives white. The reliquary was not a weapon. It was not a failsafe. It was a reservoir. 9,000 years of psychic residue absorbed into the warding material of the sable remittance, concentrated and compressed into this single chamber. Every soul that had ever passed through these holds had left a trace, an echo, and those echoes had pooled here, drawn by the same principle that draws water downhill, settling into the deepest point of the ship's psychic architecture. Millions of them, layered atop one another like sediment at the bottom of an ocean, and they were not silent. They were not gone. They were here. They had always been here. The hum. Throne of Earth. The hum. It was never only the current cargo resonating with the wards. It was them. All of them. Every child taken from a collection point, every old woman who died in a cell, every frightened soul who spent months sealed in darkness, pressing their terror and their grief into the warded metal around them. They were singing. Whether what remains is truly them or merely the shape they left behind, I cannot say. Psychic fingerprints, perhaps, burned into the ward work by the sheer density of suffering that had passed through these holds over 9 millennia. Or perhaps something more. The Imperium has no word for what lives between an impression and a soul, between memory and presence, between an echo and a voice. Whatever they are, they had been singing since the first cargo was loaded, and the song was always the same, and I understood it now. Standing in the center of the reliquary with tears on my face and the last pretense of my baseline humanity crumbling like ash. Where are we going? The question carried no sorrow. It carried no rage. It was genuine, patient, persistent as a tide against a shore, asked and asked and asked because no one had ever been able to hear it clearly enough to answer. Until now. Until a low-grade psyker with 41 years of proximity and a boot full of forbidden memories walked into the one room on the ship where the wards did not suppress but amplified, and heard the question in its fullness, in its unbearable 9,000-year completeness, and understood that it was not rhetorical. They are waiting for an answer. They have been waiting since the sable remittance was commissioned in the 32nd millennium, since the first cargo was loaded and the first soul left its trace in the warded metal. They do not know what happened to them. They do not know if they reached Terra. They do not know if they burned in the Astronomicon or survived the soul binding or were cast aside as too weak to be worth the fuel. They know only that they were taken and that they were carried and that some part of them remains, caught in the bones of this ship like insects in amber, and they want to know where the journey ends. I cannot free them. I do not have that power. I am Psy-Ro, the lowest flicker, a candle in a cathedral. But I can do something that no one has done in 9,000 years. I can answer the question. I can open the part of me that the scrubs have been trying to close, and I can speak to them in the language that the damned share. And I can tell them, the light still burns, ships still sail by it. You burned, and the burning mattered. That is all. That is enough. Not because I know it is true, but because they deserve to hear it, and because after 41 years of silence, the least I can give them is a voice. After that, I do not know what happens. Droon will come for me. The seneschal will make her determination. Service or sacrament, binding or fire. But perhaps there is a third option that neither of them considered, one that lives in this room, in this song. A keeper. Someone who stands at the intersection of the wards and the warp and tells the dead that they are not alone. Or perhaps I am a fool and the room is empty, and the voices are my own madness, finally breaking through the suppression. And tomorrow the adepts will scrub me one final time and put me on a gurney, and I will never think again. But the hum is so clear tonight, clearer than it has ever been. And the voices are so many and so patient, and they are asking me the question that I have been asking myself since the first day I set foot on this ship, the question that every soul aboard has always been asking, cargo and crew alike. Where are we going? I think, for the first time in 41 years, I know the answer. We are going where the light goes. All of us.